Great. Thank you so much, Britt, and welcome everyone to the discussion today. Again, my name is David Girardi. I lead the revenue optimization practice here at Forma, and I'm really excited to host a discussion today on plan design best practices for the new year. And with that, I'd like to welcome everyone to meet our esteemed individuals who will be speaking today. And I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves so you can all get to know them a little bit better. So I think we'll start with Leo. How about yourself? And we'll get ready with an introduction.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. So Leo Rocha, I'm the currently Senior Director of Compensation at CHG Healthcare. Have been in a career of many years in comp with specific focus on sales comp, mostly in the tech, financial services, and some projects here and there across the industries. Really looking forward to having this conversation today. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
Great. And Melissa?
Thanks there. I'm Melissa Fenner. I lead up our compensation team at DocuSign, as well as planning. And I've been there for around 4 years. And prior to that, I was actually in the consulting side. So consulting with a lot of different companies, but with a focus really on the tech market, particularly software as a service companies in tech, on how to drive the right behaviors using their incentive schemes.
Thanks, Melissa. And Nabil?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nabil Alzam. I'm founder and CEO of Forma AI, and similar to Leo and Melissa, my background prior to Forma was in sales comp and supporting large organizations on the planning and design side as well. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to dive in with everyone.
Great. Okay. Well, today, everyone, we're going to cover the entirety from start to end of how to design and implement your plans for the next year. So it's Q4. I'm sure you're all knee deep in plan design process right now. So I think what we'll want to start with is a discussion on the planning process fundamentals. And I'll start with a question, and I'll position it towards yourself, Melissa. If you can tell us from your perspective, what does an efficient planning process look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know what? I think it changes based on your maturity as a company. But let me tell you kind of what we're judging efficiency by there. So first off, planning isn't linear. I think it's easy to follow the calendar year and think of it as one and done, January through December or fiscal year start to end. But really it is more of a cycle. And so I think we're getting a lot of efficiencies out of looking at Q1 as the start of planning, not really just the launch of what we planned in the last fiscal. And so what I mean by that is in Q1, we focus on aligning on the success metrics for the year and what we're going to use to gauge if the plans are working, are they driving the right behaviors, have we set targets effectively? So one example of that was in Q1 of this year, we decided that the singular metric that we were going to judge whether or not the targets were being set effectively and quotas were effective was to look at the kurtosis of attainment quarter on quarter. So that would be the spread of attainment across what we hope to be that normal distribution bell curve that we all aspire for, but sometimes don't see. So we've really been focused on that as our chief success metric. We've used it quarter on quarter to gauge where we are. And that made the H1 decision, which for us was at the end of August time, about what we want to change in FY26, that's much more seamless. So as we've had a new CRO come in and leadership changes, that hasn't caused too much noise because we've been aligned around what success was being measured by. So I think that's one mark of efficient planning, to determine what it is that's going to govern success and keep that metric as the North Star or the consistent conversation point as you go, and to start really early on measuring the success so that you can make a call a lot earlier in the year. And then Q3 and Q4, it's all around that cross-functional collaboration between finance and operations and the field to then align on how we're going to plug the gaps that we've recognized in the Q1 and Q2 and ongoing monitoring for the rest of the fiscal.
Great. And so in that planning process, and maybe Leo, I'll position this to yourself, is that so I think what Melissa's hinting at is earlier the better. especially, even Q1 is not too early, but who do you, in your experience, involve in the process? I mean, obviously there's C-suite leadership, there's the sales reps, there's everyone in between. Who do you involve and when?
Yeah, another great question, Dave. And I think I would say this: there's no one size fits all answer on this one, but I would argue strongly that there is the key word here is alignment, right? For me. So when I think about stakeholders, I'm thinking about your executive sponsors up top, but also the recipients of all the work you're doing, which is really the field sales, right? So within the process, I agree with Melissa. It's never too early to start, and probably you want to have, as soon as you start getting some data, once you're into a year, you definitely should start looking at what, how your plans are performing and what you want to do going forward. And that process to me would involve things like input from the field, like sentiment surveys, lots you can do there, as well as keeping your stakeholders informed of progress and how things are going. So that to me creates this sense of no surprises, right? So at any point in time, if you need to have a conversation, either up or down your chain of command, nothing is surprising you. People know what's going on, right? And of course, there's different levels of information you're sharing with your executive team versus your field sales. But the sentiment around what we are doing, what we're trying to achieve as a company should be there, right? People should understand what the mission is and what the end goals are. So that's the alignment I think you have to drive. And I would argue work you need to have your executive team sponsoring and supporting your efforts, but you need to have at the same time your field sales understanding what your job is and what you're trying to do and what your company is trying to do, so that they're part of that game as well, and not just receiving information from others.
And Nabil, any thoughts on those particular questions about time to start and who to involve?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the sooner you should be in constant planning. I think Melissa's point is spot on, and using data to power that, whatever that metric is, right? And perfect example is like, okay, if it is quota distribution that has been recognized as a problem, then addressing that and kind of tracking it over time. I mean, there's certainly an opportunity to think about, one of the things that we've seen work very well is when you find the data points that are early leading indicators, especially when you're being like rolling out a very big plan change for the following year. If you think about what are the leading indicators that if I start tracking, I will get a sense of where it's working, where it's not. And then to double click on this, and I think this is kind of like on the data collection side, segmenting rep profiles. And when I say segmenting rep profiles is looking across the team and figuring out, we expect this type of behavior shift to occur with this plan for underperforming reps within this segment, or reps that historically have had, X or YZ performance, and then predicting what's going to happen with a new plan, and then tracking very closely to see how that's occurring, gives us a very good leading indicator of whether something is a problem and needs to change. And then, Leo, your point on like bringing rep feedback is super powerful, because at the end of the day, if the reps don't get it, where it's actually not driving motivation and right behaviors, it opens up a lot of risk, or at the very, even if it's not risk to attrition, it is risk of time to behavior change if they don't understand it.
And Leo, if I could ask you to expand on that point of the rep sentiment, what can you give everyone watching an idea of what that looks like and the frequency as to what you roll it out? Like, how many questions are we talking about? What are you asking about, and how often?
Yeah, sure. There's different ways to do that, right? And I've tried a few over the years. The one that, in my experience, has proven to be the most successful is a formal, I call it a sentiment survey, that usually I would do it, mid-year, whatever your year looks like, but sometime mid-year, at a time when there's already, enough data and there's a sentiment to be had, right? Because you've already had the plan in place for a period of time, but it still gives you time to plan and prepare for any changes you might be wanting to make for the upcoming year. So mid-year seems to be about the right timing. In my specific case, when I was running these, it was around summertime. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be, but that's what worked for us. And it's a standardized survey. Some key principles there would be not too many questions. So I kind of landed on about 10 or so questions. You want to do that year over year, right? So you try to keep those questions somewhat constant, with a little room for maybe 8 out of the 10 questions will be the same, and you'll test out a few new things you want to know year over year, but you still have history you can go back to and identify trends. And the key thing with these sentiment surveys is that once the results are in, you'll take that, right? That will inform you in your conversations around sales comp plan design and strategy, but you need to make sure what you've collected, it's relayed back to the people who actually responded to that survey. Because if you miss that step, what's going to happen is next time you want to run one of those surveys, you're going to have fewer people responding, and then fewer people responding because they feel like they're not being heard. So getting back to the sales force with inputs means what we've heard you, here's what we're doing, and also we've heard you, we're not doing this because of X, Y, and Z, or we will consider this, but not this year, but it's something that's in the plan. So provide some feedback as well, so that it becomes something that people will expect and want to participate in. And make sure that when anything you do in your future comp plans that's related to the feedback you receive, that you tie into that, so they know that their input matters, and it really drives makes a change and drives how we think about comp plans.
Right. That's great. I want to focus a little bit in this section on the common mistakes that you have all seen in your experience. So, I know in my experience, I've definitely been a part of planning where we're in the month of April and we still don't have plans out. And so obviously that's a horrifying scenario, but I'm sure I'm not alone in experiencing that. So maybe, Melissa, we can start with yourself of what are some common mistakes that you see that maybe result in something like that, where you're extremely delayed, or perhaps, just other issues in rollout process?
Yeah, I hear you on April. That's painful. I think, I think of it as the three-legged stool. You've got your comp plan structure, territory carving and account assignment, and then the quota methodology and the crediting policies. And if those three things are not being worked on and planned around in conjunction with one another, one is going to come in later, and it's going to mean that you restart what you've achieved in terms of planning. So, if we change our territories at the 11th hour come December, ready for our February fiscal launch, whatever we've planned is out of the window for the other parts of that three-legged stool concept. So I think it's really about getting those three teams to plan in unison and agree to the timelines and hold to them, which is hard. That sounds really easy in theory, but that's a large part of this planning process is change management, not only with the operations and strategy teams that are working on this, but with the field as well. And I think one of the other things that we've come across is what leads to that later delivery for plans is trying to please everyone. And it is a fine balance of inviting people's input from the field and from our cross-functional stakeholders in finance, in sales ops, customer success. All of those teams have a say and need to be involved, but you can get into kind of paralysis or when you're trying to please all of those agendas. So I think it's really important to set guardrails or constraints within which plan and quota and territory has to operate. Some guiding principles set earlier the better as a starting point. And then you can be creative within those guardrails, and that will stop a proliferation of plans happening. The more plans, the more complexity, and that sometimes leads to a delay. But it will also help keep that unison in the planning timeline between the quota territory and comp teams.
That makes a lot of sense. The paralysis comment really resonates with myself. I think involving a lot of people, I guess, Nabil, yeah, I guess with yourself as well.
Yeah, I mean, well, the one thing I was going to say is like, this is the existential problem that happened or the biggest problem in sales comp is the fact that it's disjointed ownership, right? It impacts finance, HR, sales, operations. And I wonder, I mean, I haven't seen this perfectly done anywhere, but I'm curious what everyone's perspective on the call today is. If there's a way where you can like bifurcate or attribute parts of the overall success. So if you think about, okay, this is the North Star that we're aiming for from a revenue organization, and this is what sales comp is going to drive. If there's a way where you could break up the attribution of like quota distribution is owned by the team that submits quote, like that does quota, and you almost like break up the success and are able to attribute to the right teams, would that help motivate people to get things done faster and on time? Because then they're actually getting credit. Like, this is the common dilemma, is like you need all these people at the table, but then the ownership of the outcome is also so disjointed and separated that it's, who's going to step up and take the ownership? It ends up being just like us as a comp team that does it. But curious what your thoughts are.
We've tried something similar to this year, actually. I think, it is working to an extent, but I think the issue is unless you've got a superb tool in place that's going to help automate a lot of this, there's a little bit of maybe too much skin in the game, I'll say. So if I, for example, say that we're going to handle our early renewals by doing a quarterly true up, that quarterly true up is going to be conducted by the quota team, who have to true up the retention quotas and add in any earlies and the base rate and that contract into that retention quota. So I've now designed a plan structure that requires someone else to operationalize it. Yeah. So that leads to them wanting to be part of the plan design process. So now we're back to not necessarily having bifurcated it cleanly and back to a very collaborative model. So it's a little bit of give and take about, what are the trade-offs that I'm going to be able to own the decision on, and what are the trade-offs that you're going to own the decision on? And we're each going to have to absorb a little bit of the heavy lifting or the manual labor that results in. So I think it's great to, again, start early and build that collaboration throughout the year and help problem solve the blind spots that you uncover throughout the year. So you've got a great rapport with those teams. But I don't know that you can really get to that clean ownership unless you've got a ton of automation, which is not where we are today, with a lot of the tools handling this in a data-driven way, and cutting out a lot of the manual work.
Great points. I think now we're going to move on to the second topic I wanted to talk about today. So we've covered the planning, the process, how we're going to tackle the plan design. Now let's talk about the actual components and metrics that we're evaluating on. So if we can start with looking at the mix of pay in terms of salary and commission, and I want to focus on specifics here. So not just kind of how do you decide on that mix, but let's talk about different roles. So your hunters, your retention team, and also does it differ geographically in terms of regions across the globe for global sales forces in terms of how much we pay for base salary and commission? So Leo, how about yourself? We can start with you.
I think pay mix. Thanks for bringing that up. I'm a fan of the pay mix conversation and how important it is when you think about sales comp plans. I would argue. I know some people would agree, some wouldn't, but it's the one thing that drives behavior the most is pay mix. You can get a lot of things okay, but if you get the pay mix wrong, it just impacts the behavior so much. So it's so important to get to the right mix. And there's certainly some, if you go out there, like, there are some industry benchmarks you will find around what a good pay mix is for a hunter role versus a farmer role versus a customer success manager. which a lot of times it isn't even a sales role, depending on how it's positioned within an organization. So you definitely can and should follow those. And of course, the logic here tends to be, for a hunter role, you want to have a lot more of their pay at risk. So that mix is much more, it's heavy towards their variable side, right? That's the typical approach for a hunter. And if you think about it, well, why, right? It's just the behavior that it drives. So you want that person to be acquiring new business. So they need to go out there. It's a tough job. It's difficult. It's hard. It takes time. So there has to be an incentive to that. At the other end of the spectrum, you may have roles that are much more, maintaining the customer. Think of even roles where there's an existing book of business and there's just not a lot of growth expected there, but you want to keep those customers happy and that business going. So if you set that pay too aggressive on the variable, the behavior you're driving is really for new business hunting and not to maintain your current clients. So that's where you would set. So benchmarks is one view, right? I think another thing that I like to do is to use some sort of pay mix positioning tool. I actually have one. I'll shout out to Mark Donolo. He's been on your show, Nabil, on the podcast before. He's come up with something like, I use a variation of it, but essentially what it is you run a list of attributes for each role, right? And a lot of the times what it's really measuring is the prominence of the role. How much impact does it have on revenue generation, right? And you will position several attributes of the role, and at the end of that exercise, you kind of get what the pay mix should be, right? It really shows you. It's really measuring aggressiveness around doing new business versus maintaining existing relationships, and you'll get to that. So I use that when I evaluate roles. And to the point you asked, Dave, about geographies and whether that changes, I believe it does, right? I've seen research that kind of shows that, and survey material as well that show a little bit of culturally, some geographies will be more risk averse than others, and that gets reflected in the way compensation plans work and pay mix works. I would say, though, that the general principle still holds, right? So you may find that, as an example, right, in North America, a hunter role might be on a 50-50 pay mix, base versus variable, and in some other geography that's less risk averse, maybe that mix is a little bit different, and maybe it's 60-40 or something. I think the principle still holds that even within less risk averse geographies, you would still have hunter roles more aggressively geared towards variable than some other roles, right? So you still, maybe it's not the exact same mix, but the principle that the more aggressive the behavior in terms of hungriness to find new business, the more you would shift the pay mix onto the variable side.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I think the pay mix conversation at first glance just seems like it's pretty easy, right? Okay, just get these benchmarks 50-50. But you said something that's very interesting in terms of like the aggressiveness and optimizing. And this is what's the complex part. The more aggressive you make the pay mix, like if I'm going to go on the extreme end, right? I want to go, 100% commission. Well, now if I go 100% commission or like variable comp structure plan, the aggressiveness of my pay curve can't be as aggressive, right? I can't like effectively pay you 10% of your overall on-target earning up until you reach 60% to quota, because for the first 8 months of the year or 6 months of the year, you may not hit that threshold. And so now my aggressiveness, my pay curve starts to become a problem. And so you have to find this fine balance of, okay, I want to maintain a very aggressive pay curve for a hunter type role. I want to pay my top performers 2-3 times the average, and I want to pay my bottom a fraction. But the more that you put at risk, the less you can do that without some other mechanism, whether it's a draw or whatever. And so it is actually it's not as straightforward as it first comes, when you first think about it. But it is actually it's a very important thing to get right for your business, for your selling model.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Leo.
I was just one last thought for me on this topic, right? And when we think, it's not as scary as it may seem. Well, you have to get it right, otherwise everything is dead. I think you have to get it right, but getting right doesn't mean you have to be so precise that, oh, my pay mix is 50-50, but it should be 49-51, right? That's fine, right? It's within the general principle. What you cannot have, and I would recommend avoiding at all costs, is using a farmer type pay mix on a hunter or vice versa, because then you're just driving the wrong behavior.
100%. And just there's a question that came in around like the duration of sales cycles and impact for mix. And I think this is actually the very interesting one, because the default answer is, okay, if you have a sales cycle where you're selling large enterprise deals, 4 or 5 year sales cycles, well, you're gonna have to pay these people a much higher pay mix. So maybe you go like the 70 or 80-20, right? The interesting piece is, I think that's an older approach or older school approach to a problem because we didn't have data. But this ties into this concept of like, if you actually think about it, could you actually put some of that variable comp at risk in longer sales cycles in earlier like activity type mechanics? If you're going to pay it out as a flat fee anyways, if you're going to just move your mix to 80%, but it's a hunting role, are you not better off, despite knowing that MBO type components end up, if not done properly, end up just giving the money away? But at least you tie it to some sort of data that, the more and more we have, the more we can be guaranteed that that type of upfront work is going to lead to better outcomes. So this is kind of the thing I would say. In theory, yes, it could impact it, but I actually think keeping that variable mix tied to the type of selling motion, regardless of the sales cycle length, is actually the better path.
And I guess picking up on Nabil's comment specifically about MBO, I want to move us along to, now that we've decided on, let's pretend we've decided on pay mix for our reps, let's talk about actual metrics, and maybe MBO is probably not the best one to start with, but I guess, Melissa, I wanted to ask yourself, in terms of when you're planning in your organization, what are you looking at? How are you evaluating your menu of options in terms of what am I measuring the reps on? And what is, what is fair to measure and roll out?
Yeah. So first off, MBOs, team-based goals, we've tried to outlaw them. We want to try and get to a certain level of granularity this year where we're really driving individual behaviors. So we're a SaaS company, and what's important in a lower growth environment is preserving that install base, which has made retention really important. And we've actually been looking into a pooled metric of retention plus growth. So we would actually treat those components equally, which is a first. We usually treat a seller as if 80% weighting on the growth number and 20% on retention is a bit more traditional. We've done away with that to try and make them think about the long-term value of the book and the strategic worth of just keeping revenue. Sometimes that's the answer in a low growth environment. So that's something that we've been toying with, and we likely will end up using. I think the other thing that we're starting to look at is it's very difficult to get to activity-based incentives until you have complete transparency into who does what and the ownership is clear. We're maybe not at that point. So we're trying to look at the quality of the engagement. And I may not go into this in detail, but when I say quality, how do we price a deal? Are we pricing our deals and closing our opportunities with profitability in mind, but also balancing the customer experience? And so there's a way to overlay that with the core plan where adherence to the right type of pricing structure can dial up your payout or dial it down. So you're still getting that payout, but if you're doing it in a way that's suboptimal for the customer experience and maybe optimized for you as a seller, we can tweak the payout so it's not quite as lucrative. That's another way where we're using that as almost a stepping stone towards the idea of activity-based incentive structures in the future. But until we've got clear roles and responsibilities, and it really is easy to bifurcate, retention is owned in this part of the world and growth is owned in that part of the world, we're having to focus on the quality of engagement as opposed to the specific activities that we conduct.
Right. I mean, you started with your comment, we tried to outlaw team-based MBO and MBOs. Nabil, if I if I am evaluating my sales force, what criteria should I use if I'm deciding if I must break Melissa's rule of no team base? Let's start with that. When would you actually use it? What would you consider?
Yeah, so this is where there's never a perfect answer, but I would say for activity-based incentives, it's having the data, right? And I think this is like the MBO process. If you're gonna roll an MBO, the recommendation is you have to force a pay curve on an MBO, because otherwise it's just gonna pay out 100%. It's gonna be useless. Like you need to force yourself to actually adhere to the pay curve that you would in a normal comp structure, which forces it. On the team-based one, it's actually it's interesting because it's more, I would say, the culture that you want to create within the organization than it is than it is about, or specifically, like the only time I think team-based incentives works is if doing a team-based incentive is actually going to produce a better outcome for the customer experience, which then translates into better revenue and better profitability for your business. Where that might be the case, like that, that we typically see is in certain cases, we are going, there's a go-to-market strategy shift. The data has not caught up, or there's some element of like the back office systems and operations have not caught up to giving transparency to the selling team as fast as possible to have them react. And you just want them to focus as an organization on an overall metric and kind of leverage the team-based, incentive to drive. But I would say, I mean, especially on hunting or any sort of like actual, like, running a full sales process, not customer success, like you need that person accountable, because otherwise it's very difficult to pay for performance, and team-based incentives have a very hard, it's very easy to have low performers get away. And so, yeah, there's very few cases that would actually recommend team-based incentives.
And Leo, do you have any thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I have one comment on activity-based incentives, right? So I tend to be very resistant against those, but there's one kind of rule of thumb that I try to follow to kind of evaluate, do we really need one, or is should we consider some activity-based incentive? And the way I think about it is, if every discussion you're having with your sales leaders and that your sales leaders are having with their sales teams keeps coming back to a specific activity that you're not paying on, right? But they keep referring to that as a measure of success and how we evolve as an organization, you should consider whether that metric should be a part of your comp plan, right? There are many activities that are not worth considering, but if they keep coming back to something specific, take a second look. It might be something important to measure in your comp plan.
100%. And actually, I mean, this is where the activity-based incentive, historically, we think, okay, you do this activity, you get paid. But if you could tie it to the end outcome, so you get paid, but there's just, as you said, Melissa, and like it's an attribute in terms of how you get paid based on pricing. And I don't know if exactly the plan is structured, but just kind of thinking about it, it's like having multipliers, adjusters to final pay based on activity that is relevant is actually a great way to kind of incorporate some of the things you're talking about, Leo. And just one thing that came to mind around team-based incentives, I guess when I was thinking about team-based incentives, I'm thinking like, okay, the entire customer success team or the entire like pool of hunters on the West Coast. One thing that we've seen done very, very well is when you have a model where you want the business to focus on revenue, right? In the case that you kind of like talk in this environment, Melissa, you want the business to focus on revenue retention, and you do have a bifurcated team of hunters and retention. What you want to think about, especially there where the hunters are also responsible for cross-selling net new products into larger customer base, as an example, then a team-based incentive on overall revenue in overlapping customers is actually not a bad thing, because then I can get my hunters and farmers working together to unlock opportunities for cross-sell, get my hunters to leverage their farmers' relationships for reference calls and introductions and actually work together. So they each have their own component, hunting, target or metric, farming and retention target, but then an overall metric on revenue within that combined territory. I've seen those work very well because it creates a teaming environment that's better for the customer. But not like the more people you bring into a team component, I think is where you just run into risk of, it's very easy to get away with low performance.
Right. I think your comment on the multiplier is very interesting. So that like the multiplier can also be a way to individualize a team component. So, if the philosophy, Nabil, as you mentioned, is also at the corporate level, that this is the kind of the relationships that we want to cultivate among our reps. We want a team-based feeling and a kumbaya type of feel. You can also layer on something like a multiplier to say, yeah, we're going to measure you on both a team-based approach and then also maybe give you an multiplier for your individual performance as well. So I think you guys touched on multiple ways to accomplish it. So also just I wanted to shift our conversation a little bit. We've talked about metrics. Let's talk about the actual payout mechanisms in terms of just even the simple thing of how do I design a payout curve? I have my attainment goes from 0 to 150% unlocked, essentially could go up to 300%. How do I design it? What do I consider? What kind of analyses do I run when I'm doing that? And I'll open up to the field to anyone who wants to answer.
Well, I'll kick off with something that we're currently thinking about. It's where do you want to start paying as well, right? So this is tying it back to how you're going to set those targets. So retention again. If you set a retention rate of 90% for your business, do you pay at 0 or 1% when that's the expectation, that's the base expectation of someone's role? Or do you start paying at 91% when they've gone above and beyond the expected retention rate for the business? And that will very, harshly manipulate your pay curve. And you'll start to see a much steeper pay curve based on that threshold. So I think one of the elements that we've started to look at in terms of modeling the pay curve is where exactly do we want to start that 0% attainment from in terms of attainment against a goal. The second thing I would say that we're looking at is when you pool some of these metrics together. So I mentioned pooling the expectation of the gross retained dollars and your gross dollars together. You may want to reduce the threshold at which your accelerator's hitting, because you're making them reliant upon doing two things at once, hitting retention and hitting growth. So because of that complexity, to ease cash flow concerns and to keep the incentive high, once you've made the goal a little harder, we're also looking at lowering when those accelerators hit in and it not being at that 100% of attainment and just maybe around 90% or 95% is another thing that we're taking into consideration when modeling the pay curve.
Yeah. I love that, Melissa. Thank you. I agree. One other thing that I think is relevant when you assess, how to set that pay curve is around how much you want to pay at excellence. I think that's important to have a clear picture on, and there's some misconceptions there. So again, you'll find benchmarks, right? That will kind of show you what is typically considered the right payout at the excellence level. But I remember one situation I used to work for a company many years ago where there was a discussion on whether to make those levels ever more aggressive, because there was a belief that the higher that the payout at that excellence level, the better results we would get. And I believe there is it's smart, there's a point where it's like decreasing returns, right? It doesn't make sense because you're spending too much money and it's not really driving the results, because the comp plan itself cannot solve all the problems, right? So it's not because you are increasing those payouts for those top performers that they're gonna, just sell more, not necessarily, right? So there is an optimal point, and we did a lot of testing and modeling to identify what that level was. An interesting thing that happened is we started looking at some other companies, right, and that were very successful. And we actually used one big tech firm that, just out of curiosity, that was doing very well during those years. And they were not paying, any more than what we were, right? And so the justification, why do we, they're not doing that much and they're being very successful. So it's not the comp plan, right, that's holding anything back. there's a certain level you want to get to, but there's, it's got to be a balanced approach, because, you got to have the return on that investment, and just paying more doesn't mean better results every time.
Yeah, I mean, you do want to pay your top performers like a lot and have that engagement, reduce attrition risk, et cetera. But you're right. There's some point that's kind of diminishing returns. I think the interesting piece with reducing, at the end of the day, it needs to make viable business sense of what we can actually pay. And I think a lot of the times where the real problems, it goes back to quota setting. Like, are you actually balancing your territories, and you're allocating enough to the respective territories? Because we see this all the time where, excellent points fine, average to top 15%, average to bottom 15%, all those those typical benchmarks are in line. But then you actually look at the actual attainment distributions, and you dive into the details, and you look at, are there any biases? And all of a sudden it's, wait a sec, territories that look like this tend to overperform. So we're actually not even paying our best performers. And so I think the first thing that you want to land on is, how do you, how do you gain confidence that your pay curve is actually paying the right people, which goes back to quota setting. From there, I think the only other point that you could, to justify a business case to increase the accelerators on the top end, which are only, unless you're stealing from Peter to pay, John, or they say, or whatever it is, like, unless you're really reducing the pay on the bottom end, it has to come from somewhere else. And there could be a business case if you believe that you could hire more A performers and or move more of the Bs into As, and actually have a very different sales organization where now you're increasing the productivity on a territory level. And that's, I think that's certainly possible. You see organizations that obviously pay more for sales, sellers based off the profile that they're hiring in, but they also have a higher quota burden per seller. So it all kind of works out to some degree in the end. But the one thing that, the point that you mentioned, Melissa, at the beginning on the where do you start paying for retention? We've seen it work, well, when you, of course, you say, we're not going to pay you until you get to a certain level. And so you kind of increase the rate. One of the things that I think works very well here is actually paying something out, but making it like negligible. So literally at the beginning of the year, you're still paying out on the pay curve, but you're paying out into such a, and especially if you tie it back to specific deals, like a back to $1 structure, and almost showing the reps, like, for culture change, where, hey, you used to get paid almost immediately for retention, to then shifting it and actually saying you're getting paid a fraction until you get to this level. And now you just constantly have this pool of money that is just sitting there being like, if you just get to your targets, this is how much money you'll make from all the deals that you've brought in. It's a very, very powerful motivator to take the profile that is typically not the hunter profile and make them money hungry. So I think the best case I've ever seen of this was a business that used to pay on MRR. So effectively, think about this, like, on day one, you're making 100% of your OTE for that month. And all of a sudden, we completely diverted them to being on an annual retention target and back to $1. And you effectively made the farming team that was just normally happy until they had bad retention rates halfway through the year or at the end of the year, to all of a sudden being, hungry to pay their bills and their mortgage. And now all of a sudden, early pull-in retention rates like 2x within the first 4 months of that year. Why? Because they were trying to figure a way to claw toward to get to the money. So,
and you know what? That's great on an annual plan when you're trying to solve the earlies problem. Because if you put them on an annual plan and you think of Q1 through Q4 as in period earlies, they can then pull that in and front load their retention in order to get that big payday because you've made them money hungry. I love that concept. And it means that we're going to see a much better impact to the business earlier in the fiscal year as well. So it's great from that financial standpoint for bookings and billing. So yeah.
I mean, you do with all these things, right? This is comp 101. It's like, okay, how is someone going to game it? And then you optimize. But one of the key things, if you are going to do that and then pay out, you almost need to set criteria on a deal by deal basis. Again, this makes administration more difficult. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to pay you this, a higher amount if you all of a sudden start bringing deals in at 70% retention rate, of the deal value, just to get them pulled in early. And so this is where kind of, again, layering in different components or multipliers to the actual incentive plan in that level becomes a critical factor. But yeah, the wonderful world of optimizing incentive plans.
Amazing. So on that note, I think that we've now covered the full gamut of how are we actually designing the plans, what metrics are involved, how are we structuring the pay curve. Let's now move the discussion to it's sometime during the year, whether it be Q1 or Q4. How do we know whether or not the compensation plan is actually working? And Leo, you touched on one element of this before when you were talking about the sentiment survey that you roll out mid-year. But maybe, Melissa, I can start with yourself. Is, in your experience, what are you doing? What data are you collecting? What kind of analyses are you running to figure out, is this working or not?
Yeah, so I mentioned kurtosis before. That's been our go-to kind of statistical measurement of are the plans working. And the good thing about that I'll just touch on quickly, it's a little geeky, but if you've got a high number, it's basically telling you you've got spikes, which probably points you in the direction. So it's great for root cause analysis. It's going to point you in the direction of saying that the overall, the plan, the way the quotas are set and the plan are working, but you probably got misbalanced books or there's something wonky with your territories. And if it's low, it's actually pointing you to a deficit in how you've actually set the target. So it's a really powerful metric to try and just accelerate how you improve things as well. So that's why we kind of landed on that as our singular source of truth this year to help us understand what is and isn't working. I love the sentiment survey. We don't do that. We have that, ongoing conversation with GVPs, VPs, but we haven't really opened it up to the field. One thing we have done though, is for a big transformation, actually Nabil mentioned the move from MER to an annual metric, which is something we're going through. We run pilots. And so we've taken a subset of our reps and actually put them through a pilot. It's been 2 6-month pilots with a tweak midway through the year for the second half of the pilot. And in doing that, we've actually improved change management and buy-in along the way. And we've created a sort of train the trainer for the next fiscal. And they'll be champions of the new plan having gone through it. It's hard to take a year. If you've got some, I will give it a Monte Carlo simulation, a tip of the hat. If you've got that kind of capability, it's going to allow you to optimize plans without dedicating a year to piloting them. But we didn't have that this year. So we've gone through the pilot. And I think there are some pros to it that are definitely going to ease the transition in the next fiscal to the annual metric. And of course, with every pilot, the pre and the post-mortem setup of deciding what your success metrics are for the control group versus the pilot, and then reviewing those on a quarterly basis to the highest level of the organization has been critical to help us tweak it for H2 and then decide how we're going to continue tweaking it for the next fiscal.
So we just had a question come in that was exactly on my mind that I wanted to follow up and ask you is, how do you select who goes into the pilot? Is it all within, like, is it you take all your hunter reps and some of them are in the pilot, some of them aren't? How does it work?
Yeah, so there's a few things you should take into consideration. So first off, we needed comfort level from the managers, that they wanted that who we took wasn't going to massively impact, the roll up of the territory. We did need a control group, so we couldn't take one whole territory. We also couldn't take a large enough. If it went wrong, we didn't want enough of the team to be negatively impacted. So the size had to be delicately balanced, where we weren't putting our plan at risk. So what we started to look at was tenure of individuals, so that across the pilot team would have a mixture of tenure. We looked at a territory where we were going to be able to kind of cancel out noise that was to do with macroeconomic conditions. Maybe one vertical is suffering, so they were always going to have a harder year. So we went for some territories where that wasn't the case. And then we focused on getting some A and B players based on their attainment from historical years, so that we had enough variability in the pilot, but it was a small enough subset of our overall workforce that we weren't putting that plan at risk. Those are probably the three things. There was a lot taken into consideration, but those three I'd say are most critical.
Yeah, that's a fascinating concept. I'm curious if anyone else, Nabil or Leo, if you have experience in that, this concept of A/B testing and pilots, etc.
Yeah, I would just say one of my pet peeves around sales comp is when people get asked the question you asked, Dave, about how to assess comp plans. It's very hard to find good answers. Melissa is, of course, one of the rare exceptions, as we just saw with what she shared. But most of the time, people are actually measuring something else, right? They're not really measuring sales comp plan effectiveness. They might be measuring if quota setting is good, if territories are aligned. But how can you really answer the question, is the comp plan driving the results we expect from the comp plan? And to me, the answer lies in the A/B testing principle that Melissa was sharing with us. It's very difficult to implement. So because there's a lot of resistance, it's a sensitive thing, right? And culturally, a lot of companies will try to avoid, doing something for one group versus another. And people talk, right? So it needs to be very well planned, is what I would say, in addition to all the points that Melissa raised. But to me, that's the only way you can really test out to see whether the results you got were driven by the comp plan, or was it something else? Because there's a lot of things that will drive sales results other than the comp plan. So you want to make sure you find a way through these A/B testings to identify whether what you are testing in the comp plan is really what's driving the results.
Yeah, maybe Nabil, this is a question for yourself. So I think what Leo is pointing out as an example is that if you look at your attainment, your national attainment for your field force, it's 110%. Do you just hang your hat and go, yeah, great, the comp plan's working, right? Like what? So that's probably what he's saying is not a great measure, but what would you measure instead to say whether or not the incentive is?
Well, this is kind of what I touched on earlier, right? It's like we do not bring, or for many reasons, this has not been possible and has not been done with most organizations, is bringing sales activity data into the planning process and the KPIs that you track around success of a comp plan. It's very difficult to do because it's very messy data. It's massive volumes. You think about every single email, every single meeting. But in an ideal state, you are actually tying a comp plan to specific behaviors that we're seeing. So for example, if all of a sudden we go from MRR to annual base retention, I should see more activity, emails, meetings getting scheduled with further out renewal cycles than I saw in the previous year. And if I'm not seeing that type of sales activity occur, then likely the plan is not there. I think to Leo's point, that data and the infrastructure to do that is not available in most organizations. And so the only actual measure that you have is waiting to see what the results are and then really digging in to the data, the segments of the population of the sellers that are actually performing incrementally to last year. You can do a bunch of different analysis, but it's not your quota distribution at 100%. I agree with Leo on that. I think, that being said, quota distribution and having that as like a North Star metric is very important because 80% of the comp is your quota. But it's just knowing that, okay, the last 20% that's being driven by the actual mechanics and the metrics that are being tracked are, is definitely harder. But yeah, the A/B testing is great. There's a lot of infrastructure that has to be done. Where I've seen it done, and this is I know we're almost at time here, but Melissa, I could have 1,000 questions because I've seen it done where the reps themselves have an idea of that they're on the beta or like the pilot, and they actually see both plans calculated in real time, and there's a commitment to pay them on the higher either of, but effectively the new plan is designed to drive a behavior that's more lucrative, and so you get the buy-in because they see it right in front of them, and then they can be advocates for the rest of the organization if they do the right sales behaviors. But I've seen it done a bunch of ways. It's never easy. It requires a lot of change management, and you get a lot of questions and equity type questions of like who got selected, especially if they make more money. And so comp is it's a sensitive subject. No one wants to talk about it. Right?
Indeed. So everyone, we have four minutes left, I think. In the last 4 minutes, I just want to let the audience know we want to cover new and emerging trends in comp, and so this won't necessarily be similar to the other portion of this. We won't go into a deep discussion, but I've asked all three panelists to come forward with an emerging trend that they wanted to present to everyone and talk a little bit about. And so maybe each prepared one topic, and I think we're going to start with Leo yourself, if you want to introduce your emerging trend and speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So real quick, the emerging trend I have started to see is the concept of more flexibility in sales comp and really allowing the rep to choose a portion of their comp plan, right? Not the entire comp plan, how they're going to get compensated, but they're giving, essentially, think of the concept of a menu of options. And that's perhaps, you know, a 20% component of their comp, could vary a little bit, but it's not the bulk. But it's kind of given, you want to choose your own comp plan, choose your own adventure, right? It's 1, 2, or 3. There will be different choices, of course. But it kind of puts the idea there, it puts them a little bit more in control of what they want to do. Those options are pre-selected, right? So it's not like they're choosing anything. So they're all tied to what we want to do as a business. But it does give a sense of ownership and accountability and just really control that really drives behavior. We see a lot of, we've tested that. What we've seen is a lot of engagement around whatever the choice it is that they end up making.
Interesting. Melissa, would you like to go?
Sure, yeah. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but I think the importance of, we call them auxiliary programs. Sometimes people refer to them as kickers or multipliers. But those programs that you lay on top of your core plan are becoming really critical, especially when you think about the consumption-based business model versus a seat-based business model, which a lot of the SaaS companies are going through. And what we're starting to see is that we could be comping based on the revenue of a deal, but actually seeing the seats decline, because you might go and do something that's not great for the customer, but price them well to be favorable for your payout as a seller, but increase the price outside of the expectation that we have. And so what we want to try to incentivize between bridging the gap between a consumption-based and a seat-based pricing model through dynamic pricing controls is this ability to dial up and down the pay rate of a deal depending on your adherence to those pricing controls. And that's going to allow us to take a bit of a closer look at, are we adding volume to the deal in the format of seats or the volume of the SKU that you're selling, or are you just manipulating the deal size through pricing? And if you only solely do it through pricing and you're not really expanding that account, you'd actually get paid less. So it's, again, that idea of the quality of the deal structure for the good of the customer and that customer first mentality, but also providing some flexibility in the plan that allows it to work or drive the right behaviors irrespective of it being a consumption-based deal or a seat-based deal. So I think that's going to be really important going forwards for those of us that are in a subscription model moving to a seat-based model.
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, just kind of right. I think, Leo, your point and the menu option, just the way I've seen it done very well is on quota setting. So basically, take a little bit of a higher target, you get a higher pay curve. Take a little bit lower target, you get a lower pay curve. And if you do the financial modeling well, it actually ends up being great for the business. And there's a commitment and ownership of the quota. But I think, Melissa, your point on the shift, like in sales comp, we are going to execute on all the go-to-market shift that's happening. Clearly, value-based pricing, consumption-based pricing is coming. It's the way that organizations want to buy. It's just naturally going to translate now to sales comp. And so just to kind of on that topic, thinking about what's going to come in the next 5 to 10 years is AI is disrupting the sales space, whether it's different roles that's going to change, whether it's the compute that we're going to start to allocate to sellers, because the more compute they use from an agent or like AI agents that support them, the more they potentially get an up, imagine they get an up level or have a shortcut to getting to more revenue. How do you now factor the sales motions that are going to be run in a world where you do have AI supporting every single seller that you have and interacting with the customers to the world of comp? And I think that leads to all kind of interesting discussions.
Excellent. Well, I know in the interest of time, we've had a great discussion today. We're 1 minute over time. I want to thank Melissa, Leo, Nabil, yourself for joining today. It's been a great discussion. I know that everyone will get a recording of this, I believe, on Monday. And again, thank you for joining everyone and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
All.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Leo.